disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. Just use an 8mm wrench. And slide that to the side. Underneath, we want to drain the coolant out. There's no drain on the radiator, so underneath where the lower radiator hose is, you want to put a drain bucket, and we'll use some hose clamp pliers. Loosen up the hose clamp. You want to make sure this is also cold. The engine's cold when you do this. You don't want to do this with hot coolant. Loosen that up. And then just grab the hose. Try to rock it back and forth a little bit. And be careful not to splash yourself. If you squeeze this hose clamp far, it will lock in place. So just use some different hose clamp pliers, and you can slide that off. It's a little bit easier. And just let the coolant drain out nice and slow. For this job, you do not have to have the fan or the fan shroud off or even the coolant hose off. It's just a lot easier to see what's going on with all that stuff off. You would just need to go straight to taking this belt off right here. Using a belt tensioner tool or even a 3/8 drive ratchet, you want to go over to the tensioner, and there's a spot right here where that goes. Loosen the tension on the tensioner, and then you can take the belt off. Take it off the power steering pulley first. Then you can loosen the tension on the tensioner. Take that tool off. Take the belt off the alternator, off the idler pulley, off the AC compressor, off the water pump, and then off the crank pulley. And slide it out. Take this bolt out here, use a 10mm socket. Take this bracket off. There's two 15mm bolts right here and here. Take those off. And there's a bolt on the back side here. Use the same 15mm socket. Slide that bracket off. Now take the bolts out for the alternator. Use a 15mm socket. It's 3 bolts for the alternator. I'm going to disconnect the connector on the alternator right here. Just lift this up. You can use a pocket screwdriver. Slide that connector off. Then under here, lift this boot up. Take that nut off. Use a 10mm socket. Take that nut off. Slide it out. And slide the alternator out. This is the way you're going to access this hose from up top. You don't need to remove the intake to do so. You're going to need some hose clamp pliers to move the hose clamp. Squeeze that down. You can move it off the hose, just like that. Grab the hose, just twist it back and forth, and you can slide it off. And it comes off just like that. You can take that hose clamp off. I'm going to use a 10mm socket. Take these 2 bolts out. There's one up top, there's one underneath. Take that lower bolt out and take the upper one. And grab the housing and slide it off. Make sure the gasket's on there properly. And just clean up the area right here. You can use a rag. And slide it in position. And get the bolt started. we'll snug those up. That's good. I'm gonna slide the clamp back on there. We're gonna reuse that clamp. If the clamp is extremely rusty, you wanna use one that's more of a worm clamp style. And take the top part of the hose, slide that over. Make sure it's positioned correctly so it's out of the way. That looks good. Now I'll move the clamp using the hose clamp pliers. Just slide it in position. And let it go. That looks good right there. Grab the hose, make sure it doesn't move. Take the alternator and put the power cable on. We'll just move that wiring harness out of the way first. Take the nut, get that started. You want to clean up that terminal too if it seems like it's corroded. Just use a wire brush. And snug this nut down. Not too tight, just snug. And put this cap on. Just make sure it's not loose. It's going to go over there, the protective boot. Now we can plug in the connector, line that up, lock it down. Line the alternator up, take the bolts, one underneath, get that one started first. It's a little tricky to get to. It's in the right position, then get the other top two in. Make sure those are all tight. And get this bracket lined up. Get the bolts started. Tighten those down. Take the belt, we're going to go around the alternator pulley first, then it's going to go around the idler pulley, around the AC, and up and around the water pump. And if you still have the fan on the vehicle, you're going to have to go around the fan and come down to the crank pulley. And over the tensioner pulley, and then we're just going to hold tension over here. Just double check everything, make sure it's all lined up correctly. That looks good. And take your belt tensioner tool or a ratchet. And just slide it over the power steering pulley. Let off the tensioner and double check, make sure it's around everywhere. That looks good. Oh, down below. Take the clamp, put the clamp over the hose, get the hose on the radiator, and tighten down the clamp. Just snug and just make sure it's not loose. That looks good. Now add your appropriate coolant and level. You want to make sure you put the radiator cap back on, snug it up. Make sure you add fluid over where the reservoir is to the appropriate level. You want to make sure you run the vehicle for about 10 minutes, constantly checking to make sure it's not overheating and looking at the level. You never want to open the radiator cap when it's hot. After it's run about 10 minutes and the engine's warmed, you can shut the vehicle down, let it cool down, and adjust the levels accordingly. Connect the battery, line up the terminal, and snug that up, make sure it's tight.